Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this book launch of The Utility of Land Power to the British State by my colleague, Dr. Jack Watling. I should say that his paper, his book, The Whitehall Report, is available via the RUSI website and is free to download. So I would encourage you after this to make your move to that and do so. So, utility of land power. Events in Ukraine show that there still is considerable utility in land power as a lever of national power. But it's always sensible to take time to consider how to capitalize or to maximize that utility. So I suppose you might ask the question, why now? And it's not a knee-jerk reaction to Ukraine. The genesis behind this is that last year, the United Kingdom produced the Integrated Review that describes an era of competition. And it moves the UK towards a very classic Elizabethan maritime strategy, the kind of thing that Elizabeth I in the 16th and 17th century would be familiar with. So after 2 decades of a very clear dominance for the land domain, we're now moving into one in the UK in which maritime may be said to be in the ascendancy. The Defence Command paper introduces the idea of armed forces in support of a new construct of protect, engage, constrain, and warfight. And the former Chief of Defence Staff made the point quite clearly in speeches last year and the year before that the UK armed forces would be expected to be doing more in the engage and constrain space and not solely there for warfighting. All of that, of course, then changes the context within which we think about the utility of force generally, and in this context, specifically land power, because the MOD has to make choices about how it's going to deliver that power. In order to do that, it helps to have a framework or some principles against which to make judgments and trade-offs. And that's what this book seeks to achieve. It's an understanding of what land power delivers, its unique strengths, and how it fits in a multi-domain integrated force in which the components are less independent. Now, without being clear about the principles, integration is, I would argue, if not impossible, then certainly very much more difficult. Jack doesn't set out to argue for this or that armored fighting vehicle, missile system or rifle. Rather, what he does is offers a way of thinking about the balance of the force and the choices that need to be considered and the purpose to which they will be put. I think it offers a coherent intellectual framework for MOD decision-making for the land domain that can then be used to turn ambition into programs and ultimately into capability. I think it's a very timely report. Jack will speak for about 30 minutes, and everything he says will be on the record, including question and answers. When it comes to question and answers, then please do put those into the Q&A box on your screens. I would just make the point that there are about 460 of you dialed into this, and I will do my best to get through the questions. But if I don't name check you because I have to aggregate a number of questions on similar topics, then please forgive me. But it's a measure, I think, Jack, of the interest that your book has sparked that we have so many people on the call today. With that, then, Jack, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And this is it's been a really interesting project to work on, because I was essentially asked quite upfront, what is the army for when it comes to the United Kingdom? And as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at doctrine and tactics and how armies fight, that might seem a self-evident answer available. But in reality, you really have to look at the specific state and what that state is trying to achieve. And my observation would be that for the last 3 years in which I've been engaging extensively with the army, there's been 2 really separate conversations going on about capability, force design, and intent. One of them is a strategic political discussion happening with a relatively small part of the army in with central government. And that conversation has been largely about the future operating environment, the kinds of tasks that HMG wants options for, and the demands that are made of the force. Another conversation, quite separate and in a different silo in many cases, exists in mainly Army HQ and in the field army on capability, doctrine, and concepts. And what we often observe is that in that environment, there is an assumption that because doctrine is the handbook that we follow in terms of how we operate, force design is about building the optimum force to deliver the doctrine, even if the doctrine was written to fight a battle that doesn't really correlate with the political demand anymore. And so the purpose of this book was really to ask some of those fundamental questions to establish what is being asked of land forces, and from there to establish some tests so that when formations are designed out of the integrated review and through Future Soldier, we can measure whether or not they are policy relevant, whether they give policymakers what they are asking for. So I'm going to run through three broad areas in this presentation. The first is, what are the asks of the British Armed Forces jointly? Because almost any military campaign requires joint enablement and contributions. The second is, what do land forces bring to that uniquely? And the third is, what are the characteristics of a British land force that can meet that demand? So the first one, in terms of the demand, I would split that into three broad requests when it comes to what the armed forces deliver. The first is the prevention of the outbreak of major conflict through deterrence. And the primary threat to lead to major conflict is hostility from Russia. So we might define that as deterrence of Russia escalating to large-scale warfighting. Now, in some ways, that is similar to a very old problem that we dealt with extensively in the Cold War, but there are also some really important differences. The biggest one in my mind is that, firstly, while powers are nuclear, there is a real desire to cap escalation. But while that might lead to a desire to rapidly bring conflicts to a close and to geographically limit fighting, it doesn't mean that for the limited period before that escalation sets off, fighting at very high intensity is not possible. In fact, in Ukraine, we are observing a buildup which could lead to just such a conflict. But if you look at 1991, for example, in the Gulf War, that was a very quick land campaign, only a matter of days to destroy an army and leave a state fairly defenseless. And so what we observe is that the risk for high intensity conflict is that the judgment by an adversary that a limited war is winnable and in their interests may prompt them to apply armed force. The concern, of course, is that that would spread and escalate, and there are various reasons why that might happen. But on the other hand, historically, states have actually worked very hard to limit geographically and from an escalation point of view, the boundaries of conflict. And there I would highlight the Korean War as a good example, a conflict in which two nuclear powers participated. One of them seriously considered nuclear use and made statements to that effect, but actually it remained a high intensity conventional fight. And the challenge that this generates for land forces, which is quite different from the past, I think, is that rather than the Cold War or post-Cold War conception that has predominated in NATO, where we view it as hostility leading to a seizure of territory, and then NATO has to mobilize and retake that territory. When you start thinking about the escalation dynamics and the short duration of these sorts of limited fights, the probability is negotiation will freeze the conflict before the Iron Mountain has been built in Germany and NATO has started moving east to reclaim what's captured. And so there is a much greater emphasis, I think, in terms of the demand on deterrence, on winning the first fight, preventing the enemy from thinking that they can achieve their political objectives through force in the first instance, which leads to some quite different demands of land forces. The second component of that is that whereas historically we've often been quite confident about where a fight might break out, today it's actually very geographically dispersed. And therefore there is a need to have operational maneuver capability in order to apply that deterrent effect before fighting breaks out where it is relevant. Now, the second kind of group of demands on the armed forces that I would highlight might be called deterrence by punishment against those who are threatening British interests globally. You can't really deny, in a world that's interconnected and economically complex, the enemy being able to target your economic interests around the world or your nationals or political interests, because there are just too many points of vulnerability. But what you can do is you can impose cost on them doing it, and that severely limits the extent to which they can do it. Whether that be, and I think there are some real drivers in the way that the international system is working, which mean that that is often how states will target one another. For example, the UK is very dependent upon LNG, gas imports from Qatar. And Iran could quite seriously threaten or drive up the price of that if they were to have the Houthis, for example, launch ACSMs against certain ships. Escalation against that is complicated, and patrolling by naval vessels may be one aspect to it, but actually there are a few points in the supply chain that can be targeted. I'm not going to go through a detailed list of all the UK's vulnerabilities, but when you start mapping them out for any country, you realize that deterrence by punishment is more important than deterrence by denial. Oh, I've gone into the dark. Let's see whether I can bring it back. If not, I'll be a silhouette for a while. There we are. So when we start thinking about deterrence by punishment, there is a need to be able to conduct raiding, to understand what constitutes imposition of a proportionate cost on an adversary. And I think that's important for legal reasons as well as for escalation ones. But again, that requires a global footprint. And the third demand that I would highlight is the building of influence. And the reason I highlight influence as so important is that what we're seeing is that both climate change and population growth, combined with increased multipolar competition, are leading us to a position where very often there will be too few resources for everybody, or at least within a timely fashion. A good example of that might be the coronavirus pandemic, where we saw the desire for vaccines and the competition for medicine leading to some pretty binary choices out of those countries that were suppliers as to who they prioritized in delivering contracts to. And that sort of dynamic can play out across a lot of resources. Now, if you are wanting to prevent your country from falling down the list of priorities, then it is really important that when a government is weighing up the balance of effort in terms of how they engage with you and where they prioritize your interests, there's more than just economic ties, because the UK doesn't have the clout to be that partner. But if there are wider security and cultural ties, and defense plays a key part in that, then you become a strategic partner who will be prioritized for longer term reasons. And there's a lot of history behind countries tying their economic interests to their defense interests in that regard. So those are kind of the three categories of task, and I'm happy to go into detail in those on the Q&A. But what does that lead to in terms of how land forces contributes to delivering those missions? Well, when it comes to land forces as opposed to the other forces, I want to highlight three really important kind of characteristics that land forces have. The first one is persistence. So when we think about maritime forces and air forces, they are highly mobile, and their mobility is inherent to their existence. They can project force over very considerable distances at short notice. But that also means that they can be withdrawn very quickly. And it's actually much more resource intensive to maintain a presence with those forces than it is to reach somewhere quickly. Maintaining a blockade or a no-fly zone, for example, requires that the state that is imposing that is the one that is expending a huge amount of resource and expending the political capital to maintain it. Land forces, by contrast, are very, very resource intensive to move, but once they are deployed, they have a pretty significant persistent presence. And what that means is that, firstly, when you deploy land forces, assuming that it's more than just light infantry, you are really making a commitment to a country, because you can't necessarily pull them back that fast. So it sends a much better deterrent message, and it highlights your commitment. But it also is quite valuable because they are very survivable. So the second component thing I would highlight is that there is a real asymmetry between the different domains. And land forces are the most asymmetric in terms of the resource imposition, the challenge that they pose on the adversary. For an air force, if you look at most historical air force engagements, they tend to be over very quickly. They lead to absolute outcomes in which air forces are either destroyed, suppressed, or achieve victory. You very rarely get slow attritional struggle, partly because there just aren't that many aircraft involved when it comes to modern planes. Similarly, with navies, you can have protracted competition, but what that tends to look like is people staying out of each other's range. When they actually decisively engage, even the loss of a single capital ship, as with the General Belgrano, can drive an entire navy back to port. And so it's not that the stakes are any lower, in fact, they're much higher, but that because you're dealing with very small numbers of platforms, you end up with decisive outcomes. Land operations, by contrast, are very, very resource intensive to destroy an enemy land formation. And because of the vastly higher number of engagements, it's therefore often very indecisive unless you amass that resource. And that's quite valuable, because what it means is that you can deploy relatively small footprints, and the enemy has to really bend themselves out of shape or deploy a significant amount of capability to be confident in rolling those forces out, which means that they also have to message their intent. The other aspect to this is that whereas with air and naval forces, you almost inherently message an ambiguous intent as to whether it's defensive or aggressive when you commit them. With land forces, it's very obvious when land forces are posing an offensive threat versus when they are purely defensive, because if they don't have the enablers to conduct longer range maneuver, then they're not going to be conducting offensive operations. And the third thing I would highlight about land forces as a unique characteristic is that they often have a prolonged presence inside communities and can engage directly with the civilian population and the political centers of gravity in states from which they're operating. That's really useful because it means that you have a better understanding. It also means you can facilitate access to wider government, and you can therefore build influence, understand the environment, and build relationships and work with partners. Air forces, there's very limited history, for example, of air forces conducting partnered operations. It tends to be, as with the Afghan Air Force, one that is provided and enabled externally rather than one in which there is extensive collaboration and partner force capacity building. So those are kind of three broad important contributions of land forces to this effort. And I think when you start looking at that matchup between what land forces offer and what the UK demands of the armed forces, you start seeing some characteristics of what a useful UK land force would need to be, and therefore the follow-on from that is need to have. And so I'm going to outline a few of those characteristics briefly before talking about some of the implications, what the Army prioritizes. The first one that I want to highlight is that you want an informed force. If you are trying to shape the battle, if you are trying to enter before the first fight to deter that major war fighting, if you are trying to calibrate your deterrence by punishment in an environment in order to make sure that you manage escalation appropriately, but you send the right message, you really need to understand the environment that you're operating in. And that means you need a forward presence, not only through defense engagement, but also through liaison, loan service personnel, and the multiple ways in which you can have a presence on the ground using land forces. It doesn't have to be a huge number of people, but it does have to be people who are empowered to actually get out there, learn about the space that they're operating in, and provide that information back to the force. To give a really good example of why that matters, if we think about Pakistan, and the decision to conduct a raid to kill Osama bin Laden, which I think was a justified option, because it wasn't done in consultation with the Pakistani government. There was a massive amount of blowback, and it was happening anyway, but it helped push Pakistan into a strategic realignment away from the US and towards China, which we're dealing with the consequences of now. By contrast, if we look at British operations in Kenya, where there has been a threat to the UK from Al-Shabaab and other groups that has gone through Kenya at times. But there is an ability to engage those threats upstream, working with the Kenyan government because of those partnered relationships. And what that means is there isn't the same blowback, because the government in the operating space is actually supportive and engaged and part of that effort. So that's a really important ability to have an informed and engaged force with your partners around the world. The second thing I would flag is that British forces need to be expeditionary. There's no two ways about it. If we are going to project power, we need to be able to move capability from either our training areas abroad or the UK to the theatre in which they operate. And that means they need to be deployed by sea or air. It means that the Army has a very clear demand for sea lift and for strategic mobility. But it also means that the Army needs to design its platforms so that they're deployable. And you can forward deploy certain elements. I would say that deploying some heavy combat arms into certain critical theatres, advanced forces, is very sensible. But what we are never going to be able to do, I think, is have enough combat service and combat service support elements to be able to forward deploy all of those into the various theatres where we might need to operate. And so those elements absolutely must be expeditionary. And we can almost measure, I think, how effective our units of action are by whether or not our combat service and combat service support elements are expeditionary, can be deployed rapidly, and whether those capabilities provide unified units of action which have all of the enablers that you would need. Critical to that, I think, are protective enablers. And the interesting thing here is that we see the same enablers being required, irrespective of whether you were averting a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen from the breakup of a oil tanker off the coast, or whether you were operating in the high north or Eastern Europe against Russia. The scale of threat is different. You're going to have to deploy more defensive capabilities given the volume of threat. But actually the Houthis are using loitering munitions, artillery, mines, ballistic missiles, and a range of other systems. And so while on a smaller scale, you still need that packet and that RAP. And if you don't have the RAP, you're not going to get into theatre without suffering very significant losses or having your theatre entry blocked. The third element is that a force needs to be fast. And what I mean by that is that the decision to deploy forces in government tends to build into a crisis. Everyone gets around a table, options are presented, and when ministers walk out of that room, they tend to want to be able to announce to Parliament or to the press that they've decided that something is going to happen. And then there needs to be some visible sign that that is being implemented. If we look at the historical record, going back over the last century, most of those decisions have to be made within around 72 hours. That's usually the decision-making space between ministers seriously engaging with the notion that something must be done on a security front and something needing to be visibly done. Now, I am not saying that the entire British Army needs to be at 72 hours notice. But what I am saying is that firstly, we took significant reductions in our readiness at the end of the Cold War as a saving, and we probably need to look at that very carefully in terms of bringing more units up to readiness. And secondly, the military needs to get much, much better at predicting when it will be called, so that when ministers ask for options, they have immediate options to put in front of them. The notion that we can have a division at realistically 120 days before it gets anywhere as a credible deterrent against anything, I think is just not sensible or plausible. Now, fortunately, very often the enemy or the adversary gives you a really clear amount of notice as to when you need to start improving your readiness. If we think about Russia's operations in Ukraine, that buildup started in February last year. It didn't really stop. There was a plateauing, but then it started building again in the autumn. We should have been significantly bringing units up to readiness then, and we should have been engaging forward then. We shouldn't have waited until it's far too late to achieve an outcome before we started that deterrent activity. And so the military needs to get much better, I think, at appreciating the speed of political relevance and giving those options quickly, and therefore surging readiness within units to anticipate when options are going to be asked for, rather than waiting until they are instructed by the centre, because politicians will leave it as late as possible to give themselves as much flexibility as possible. The fourth thing is that I think it's self-evident that when British units deploy in any serious context, they're likely to be outnumbered. And we can debate coalitions and alliances, but I think it's a really dangerous thing when you start going to alliances with it baked into your plan that your unit is combat effective because somebody else is providing all the ability to kill the enemy. As soon as you start getting into that territory, a brigade minus the ability to be effective, you are a net customer of limited capability across the alliance rather than a contributor. And so I think it's really important that the UK essentially privileges firepower in its units, both because that provides a deterrent effect. It means that for the enemy to engage a British unit, they know they are going to get a lot of stuff coming back at them. But secondly, because it gives the alliances that we work through confidence that When we make commitments, we will show up with something that doesn't arrive and start making demands on our allies, but instead can be put in place and will really, punch. The measure for that, to my mind, given that we are deploying much fewer personnel and smaller units than our adversaries, is whether or not the units that we deploy have more firepower than the equivalent echelon that they might find themselves facing. It's a very simple measure, but I think it should be the yardstick by which we measure whether or not we are effective. And the fourth one I would highlight is compatibility. There we are, the light has returned. Compatibility is a tricky one. There's multiple aspects to this. Firstly, we need compatibility with the joint force. The fact that we do not have joint capability development in a way that allows our strategic mobility to be aligned with ground combat vehicles so that we can actually get it all into theatre without pulling the whole thing to pieces first is a real problem with our procurement process and with the strategic centre. And so there needs to be much more joint, or STRATCOM, I suppose, could engage through multi-domain integration, planning for those interdependencies. The second element of compatibility is that we need to maintain compatibility with our allies, even as we build bespoke systems that are highly capable. If we don't make that a key priority, and that may mean accepting slightly less effective equipment, but if it means that we can plug and play with our allies, that is very useful. And the third one, I think, is cultural, the cultural ability to make yourself compatible with others. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you go and work with many partner forces around the world, they will do things differently. And if you walk into the room, and I have observed officers doing this, and telling people this is how it is done, then they won't necessarily argue with you, but they also won't necessarily cooperate. So you need to be humble, to understand, and to engage with those people so that you can essentially be prepared to be flexible in your own processes to ensure compatibility with partners. And the final point I'd make is compatibility from an industrial point of view. The British Army is not a large enough customer to be able to make the procurement of almost any bespoke platform commercially viable. And so if we are wanting to get effective capability at cost, then, and at the scale that we need it, then we need to make sure that it is exportable, and therefore that capability needs to meet the requirements of partners and allies, and potentially, if it's modular, be interchangeable with some of their capability. If we're not thinking in those terms when we design the requirements for our systems, and building simple, robust systems is much better than trying to make complexity the driver of our capability, then we simply won't be able to afford enough equipment to be relevant, even if the single missile that we've actually managed to buy is phenomenally effective in the limited task for which it was designed. So those are some tests, I think, by which we can look at the British Army. And looking at the current structure and trajectory as regards Future Soldier, I think the record is mixed. I criticised elsewhere various aspects of the integrated review, but I think the integrated review and Future Soldier does move the force in the right direction in some of these areas. Nonetheless, we can kind of see how it measures up at the moment. When it comes to being an informed force, what I would say is that A, we are building the structures to gain that capability through 6th Division and its subordinate units, but there is a cultural barrier to us achieving that. I am always amazed when I engage with Army units about how much knowledge and expertise and passion for different parts of the world exist in the force, and language skills and all sorts of other things. And I'm always completely baffled at how badly the force tracks those skills, gets the right people to where they need to be, and values the person's experience rather than the particular job title that they hold at the time. When I was, I've been in plenty of headquarters where absolutely the wrong person has been very diligently following the process that they've been taught for a task, when there are a couple of other people who on a previous, couple of jobs absolutely have the expertise to unstick the problem fast. But they are not drawn upon because their job is a different branch or different component of the headquarters. And so we need to get much more informed about the talent that the force has, and much more prepared to fluidly draw on that talent to make sure that the expertise that's built up over people's careers is actually exploited and leveraged throughout their careers. So that's a cultural thing. That's not so much about finance. In terms of the expeditionary components, again, I think we're moving in the right direction in some areas. If you look at SkySaber, for example, it's not only a highly capable system and a system for air defense that is competitive with many of our allies, something that our allies would want. It's the kind of capability you can, if you say that we're going to commit it, then people will be very gratified by that. It demonstrates commitment, but it's also something that we can project, and it's mobile. So it's a very good system, and it also meets that requirement. On the other hand, it's evident that we don't have enough of it. And I think there's a requirement to appreciate what critical mass is, and therefore to procure at that mass when we start talking about those really useful capabilities. On the other hand, our engineering capability, for example, is woefully inadequate in terms of its expeditionary capacity. And so a lot of our enablers, including medical enablers, for example, are grouped up into hospitals that are too large and not deployable to support many of the types of operation that we're wanting to conduct. So we need a lot more detail on CSS in particular if we are to turn the force into an expeditionary one, rather than one in which there are lots of expeditionary light infantry, but you will never get permission to deploy them because you don't have the enablers. In terms of speed, I think we are not there. It's absolutely evident that we do not generate options fast enough. But Future Soldier does offer some prospects to getting there. Again, the question is how early the force is in deciding to start improving the readiness of its units or bringing units up to readiness long before a political decision is made. And an example of where I think that was done right is actually the COVID response. The army started to prepare to support the government over COVID long before the government told the army that it would be doing that. Firepower is the area where I think the British Army is most deficient at the moment. It is outranged, outgunned by almost every echelon opposite a British formation. And there is a tendency in a lot of British thinking to believe that the maneuverist approach can essentially mitigate an absence of firepower. And therefore, that precision and hitting the right target means that you don't need high volumes of fire. That is an illusion which we have lost in almost every major conflict that we have ever engaged in. The first thing that happens is people start dropping a lot of those illusions and upgunning fast. And it's always cost us at the beginning of wars. So we shouldn't make that mistake again. We need to start increasing both the caliber and the number of calibers and the number of ATGMs across our formations, and stop thinking that, well, stop trying to be too clever for our own good, essentially. You win the space to maneuver by causing problems for the enemy, and you cause them problems by demonstrating that you can hurt them if they get anything wrong. And then the final one on compatibility is actually something where I think we are in a really good place, because coming out of a number of campaigns where we have worked very closely and extensively with allies and partners, there is a lot of corporate knowledge and a lot of relationships across NATO that mean that actually compatibility is reasonable. The problem I see is that the next generation of capabilities we are talking about are bespoke national capabilities that the J6 structure doesn't necessarily fit with what partners are doing. They're modernizing in their own direction. And so there is actually a real risk that we start diverging. And I think we need to be very forward-leaning with our allies in making sure that we maintain the interoperability that has been very hard won, rather than running off in different directions as we return to warfighting. So that's an overview of the paper. There's a lot of detail in it, but really it's about trying to establish those real conceptual building blocks and tests so that we can measure whether or not what is being built over the next decade is the appropriate force. And with that, I will hand back to Paul to cohere your questions and challenges. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of the paper. I'm very grateful for that. I really enjoyed your characterization of the demand, and then a set of homework marking at the end. And I thought it was very balanced. Your concept of informed, where we're pretty good at the moment, but there's room for improvement, particularly in the context of cultural barriers and talent management. Expeditionary, and your sense that we're moving in the right direction. I will return to that because there was a question being posed about why should we need to be expeditionary, but I will come back to that. A question about speed not being there yet, and a question about fires particularly, and the lethality, which I know the CDS, the new CDS, has spoken about quite considerably. And then your positive ending with compatibility. And again, it won't surprise you there are questions on alliances and interoperability. For those of you who do wish to ask questions, please do make sure you put them in the Q&A. I've got 13 already, around various themes, alliances and interoperability, something on mass, which I'll come to in a moment. But Jack, your point about the demand, you described demand as, if you like, deterrence by denial, which you can reflect against the warfight element of the integrated operating concept. You then spoke about deterrence by punishment, which broadly connects with constraint in the way you described it with raiding and things of that sort. And then you spoke about influence, which was engage. I didn't get a sense from what you said. There was something there that spoke specifically to the protect components. And I wondered if you could just give us a few words on that element, please.
So you're entirely correct. There isn't a protect component. And I do think there is a role for protecting some of the UK's overseas territories that the military and the army will continue to have. The use of those territories as overseas bases and therefore hubs, regional hubs, as it were, in many ways guarantees that you have forces there. And so it mitigates the threat to those exposed positions to a certain extent. But when it comes to the UK homeland, we have got ourselves into a really bad position in which we are committing more and more of the force into jobs that are not defence's responsibility. And the government can call on defence to fill sandbags for flood defences or jab people or guard the Olympics or help the police or whatever. That is a reflection of the government failing to do its planning and the government failing to adequately resource civilian agencies. It shouldn't be the military's role. And every time the military is called upon to do that, I think that is a vivid demonstration that the government has failed elsewhere. And so I don't think the military should primarily plan for it. I think the military should be quite firm in pushing back against that demand. And so in terms of protection, I see a very limited role because I don't think there's a territorial threat to the United Kingdom itself. And so while, yes, as a last resort, support to the civil power is something that I'm sure will continue to be put on the forces, I don't think it should be something that the forces advertise as a capability to government, and it should be made fairly clear to the Home Office that they need to get their stuff in order.
Thank you, Jack. It won't surprise you to hear that we've had questions in the context of mass. And conversations about Ukraine often reflect on the fact that the accumulation of Russian armed forces around the borders of Ukraine is currently larger than the entire UK regular armed forces. And it suggests, therefore, that we just don't have enough mass. Is that too simplistic a view? And if so, what do you think the issue is for the army going forward on that?
So two slightly different questions there. The first one on mass, yes, we don't have enough people, we're going too low. And the reason that we're going too low is actually that what you will find is all of the key enablers for the force will suddenly drop to, one deep in all of the capability areas for staffing and working out plans. And the very small number of people who are deployable at a given time within each of those enabling components will just be run ragged and will probably run into retention issues because people at some point will want to spend some time with their families. So I think we are going to run into an issue as regards to the size of the force, and we'll probably need to bring it back up again. But that's a separate question from the fighting power of the force. That's more about troop rotations and sustainability as an organization. When it comes to deployability as a fighting formation, I've just spent 2 weeks in Ukraine, and one of the things that I think just has to be said up front is it doesn't matter how many tanks the British Army had, plausibly, even if we had like 4% GDP being spent on defense and most of it was going into armor, we would not go to war with Russia over Ukraine alone. We would not go in front of our allies in NATO, and we couldn't do it politically. And so there's almost no circumstance in which politically we are going to be fighting the Russians in Ukraine. However, the Ukrainians are really clear what they need from us. And interestingly, it's not heavy armor. I've sat down with the land forces commander in Ukraine. His demands are absolutely straightforward. It is one, medium range air defense and training in how to employ it, but also equipment and systems, because that's what gives his own forces their freedom to maneuver back. Second, anti-tank capability. Third, anti-drone capability. Fourth, EW. Fifth, anti-sniper capability. So those are things that the UK can deliver. And the critical thing in terms of winning influence is, one, get out there fast, and two, do it at a relevant scale. The real issue in Ukraine is not that we didn't have enough maneuver elements. It's that we had such a low stockpile of ATGMs that even when we distributed the ones we had, it's not enough for Ukrainian territorial defense forces. But if it had been, and if we had started spinning up our industry in March and starting to deliver it and training at scale for their territorial defense, then we had the runway that we could have really significantly increased Ukrainian deterrent capability without committing us to have to fight the Russians. And so actually having a critical mass that you can deploy for training and having the resources and being politically prepared to show that when you make commitments to allies, you follow through, buys you a lot of credibility. I was amazed in Ukraine at how well the UK is regarded in Ukraine as compared to other states because of how forward we've been in terms of the support we've provided. And there isn't an expectation in Ukraine that we would send troops to fight there.
Thank you, Jack. A couple of questions, one from Kasim Ashraf and one from Fahmi Evans, which I think are both related. They're sort of getting to the politics of this. One is from Fahmi: why does the UK need to be expeditionary? Which links into then Kasim's, what is the will to actually use the army in this way? What you've done is, I think, really brilliantly highlight what the army could do. But we've seen over recent years a desire not to be particularly engaged in expeditionary terms. So despite all of this, why is expeditionary so important? And what political will is there to actually use the army in this way, even if it builds along the lines you've suggested?
I think where this really comes down to is that we are a trading nation. We do not produce enough food or energy for our own population, and we are dependent upon the export of services and the import of goods, basically. Our security is absolutely tied up with our prosperity, our ability to fund the capabilities, both partners and our own, that keep us safe. And so if you are going to have those relationships and networks of influence that mean that people don't want to attack the actually quite vulnerable supply chains and areas of leverage that they could absolutely pull against us, then you need to have something to offer those partners. And being a country that is prepared to deploy in support of them, and when it matters, will put its own, get stuck in and involved to help allies, buys you that support. I'll give you a really good example. It's not actually a land one, but it is in the paper. There is a multinational organization called CAMLAR, which manages fish in the Antarctic. And this is mainly a scientific body, and everyone usually plays fairly nicely there. They basically set the quotas for how many fish of different types can be caught. In October, the Russians showed up to the scientific meeting for District 48.3, I think, which is the area that the UK is responsible for, and vetoed the scientific committee's recommendation on catches and quotas, which meant that any company that went and fished there was then fishing illegally. It was mainly British companies, and so that was direct economic harm to the British government. Now, the Russians weren't doing that because they have some disagreement with us about the Antarctic. They did that because they just want to get at us. And whether or not we can craft a multilateral response to that fixes the problem without really upsetting the Argentinians and all sorts of other people comes down to our defense relationships and our security ties and our cultural links and our goodwill with the other members of CAMLAR. That gives us the space. And so actually our defense activities with New Zealand and Australia, with South Africa, with others, are actually really important to propping up a number of British companies. And, you know, while that might not be critical national interest, it is the livelihoods of British citizens. And if adversaries get the idea that they can do that to us anywhere, then there are lots of adversaries who will suddenly start rolling back our interests in many, many different parts of the world. So I think we have to be expeditionary because we are a globally engaged, globally trading country, and that's critical to both our domestic prosperity and our international security.
Thanks, Jack. Another couple of questions on the expeditionary element, if I may. So there's a question from somebody called AF, which says, thank you for a crystal presentation. UK is an island territory and projecting land power will cost. What's your actionable view for the ability to quickly mobilize forces and deploy them? And that was followed up by a similar question from he says, just having lost it because a new question suddenly appeared. My apologies for this faffing around, but the question is about how do you quickly mobilize? And the question was about the balance of heavy and armor versus transportability, and how do you reconcile that challenge? Sure.
So I think there are actually some technological trends that are helping us in this regard, because the protection is, I would say, increasing in a linear fashion, and actually potentially a logarithmic fashion when you start adding in the higher constraints on weight and cost and the complexity of systems, whereas lethality is increasing in an expeditionary fashion because it is becoming more precise, longer ranged, and more destructive when it reaches the target for a lighter payload. And the fact that the longer range component is particularly disruptive in that regard, because it means that a mobility kill still basically takes you out of the fight. Whereas if you're in the direct fire zone and you get mobility kill, you can still shoot. So because of that, the value of packing on more and more protection is diminishing fast. And I won't go into the weeds on this here, but when you start looking at the maximum useful levels of protection, you are actually talking about platforms that are significantly lighter than the ones that we currently deploy as our heavy forces. So I think there are some trends there that are actually quite helpful from a technological point of view in terms of we need to lighten our capability anyway. The second component of that is that obviously main battle tanks in this generation will need to be forward deployed. You're not going to be sending them anywhere particularly responsibly. Fortunately, in terms of that particular capability, there aren't a huge number of theatres where they are vital. And so we probably can forward deploy them to Poland and the Baltic. And that's not an issue. That's a useful thing to do. What I would say, though, is that tanks are just as vulnerable as almost anything else, including things that are unprotected, if there is not an air defense wrap, an electronic warfare wrap, and fires, and therefore the ability to suppress what can kill them from range. I'm not saying, plenty of things lack their offensive combat power, but from a survivability point of view, if you cede control of the air and if you give your opponent free rein with artillery, then actually the protection doesn't buy you very much. And so the really important question to my mind is less how many tanks and more, do you have that enabling wrap to allow your combat arms, whether they be mechanized infantry, dismounted infantry, armor, cavalry, to fight the close fight. And there are various ways in which you can equip all of those types of combat arms units to do that job. So yeah, that's a roundabout way of answering. But I don't want people to take this paper as opposed to heavy armor. I think that's a very unhelpful debate. And when we're talking about offensive action, there's not much that beats a tank. But in terms of utility of the land force, the critical question is those enablers. If you don't have the engineering assets, there's no point having them.
Thanks, Jack. Moving away from expeditionary for a moment, you'll be delighted to hear. Adam asks a question about the provision of greater firepower. He says, as you say, that's essential. But should that firepower be applied by air or ground assets, and why?
It should be applied by ground assets. And the reason for that is that air forces, in terms of where they are most effective and most resource efficient, which is really, really important when you start talking about warfighting and deterrence, need the freedom to get into the deep. And when you're talking about air forces, strategic targets for them are a lot deeper than when ground force commanders talk about deep. And so the first thing is you need them to be going after those targets if you want really good effect. If we look at the campaign against Daesh, it's probably the least efficient air campaign in history. Not to say that it wasn't very effective, but in terms of the priority of targets that we had, we used air disproportionately to destroy enemy tactical positions at the expense of going after a lot of the bomb-making factories and things that actually would have had a much greater effect in terms of reducing the number of IEDs that got to the front line. So the first thing is air has its own mission, and land forces shouldn't think that they can be the primary customer. The second thing I would say is that if you are dependent upon air forces for your firepower, and without them you are very vulnerable, then you are fixing the Air Force into maintaining a fairly consistent tempo into a known area, which is essentially putting them in a kill box. And if you wouldn't ask fellow ground forces to put themselves in that position, so why you should build in as a planning assumption that air forces should is I think unreasonable. When we start looking at the proliferation of anti-air defense, anti-air systems, which is now really widespread, and sub-peer adversaries are fielding some pretty highly capable anti-air systems these days. Permissive airspace is really a thing of the past. Then the expectation of close air support as opposed to organic firepower is also something that we need to put behind us.
Great, thanks, Jack. A couple of questions on autonomous systems now. Do you think that autonomous systems change the balance of power in land combat, perhaps towards those people using them, loitering munitions and others, which was a question from Vojo Soltar, but also when do you see land unmanned systems becoming equivalent to those of maritime or air? And what impact do you think that would have on the kind of force that you've been describing?
So I think autonomous ground systems are really highly effective, or will be pretty soon. And when you line up units that are using them against units who are not, the outcome is exceedingly lopsided, because the range and speed at which autonomous systems will pick up targets and knock them down is slightly terrifying when you watch it being done. However, they tend to navigate themselves into bogs. They tend to get stuck on awkward things like tree stumps because they didn't recognize that it was solid rather than the bush. They tend to have to be constrained on very, very specific lanes so that they understand the context and don't shoot their own people. They degrade quickly. They don't have a huge amount of endurance. And those are all things that I personally don't see changing for quite a long time. And so I think that the key question when it comes to the use of autonomous systems is tempo. They can unlock hard tactical problems. In other words, they can be very, very useful for assault operations onto difficult positions and objectives. But you have to emplace them, set them up, get them going. And that all takes quite a lot of technical enablement, quite a lot of time, quite a lot of planning. And quite a few of them might get damaged, so it might be a while before you can use them again. And you're not going to have that many data scientists that you can damage them willy-nilly and expect them to be up and running the next day. Just the limitation on the number of people with those skills in the population, let alone the armed forces, means that the maintenance process of bringing them back up to readiness is a different tempo. And so I think with a lot of those systems, what you will see is, yes, they'll be employed. but they will, once maneuver has isolated an enemy position that is proving particularly problematic or expected to be problematic, you will see those systems unleashed for a short duration in order to break through and allow that position to be occupied by non-autonomous systems. The other context in which they're very useful is screening. So if you have an anti-tank screen that's made up of autonomous turrets with ATGMs, then it allows you to have a very, very small number of operators, people, effectively hold a screen for a whole flank. And that sort of thing is also very useful, but it's about emplacing them. And so it comes down to planning, and they're expensive. So you're not going to have loads and loads of them. People who preach about cheap mass through autonomous systems have usually never done the numbers on what it actually costs. And when you do the numbers on that, then the cheapness of these systems becomes pretty illusory pretty fast. There are cheap corners you can cut, and then the system becomes very vulnerable to pretty basic countermeasures. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jack. We've got 5 minutes left, and there's still quite a few questions to go through. So if I could ask you maybe to be brief. One of them, as you would expect from me, is in the context of reserves, and it was Michael Lithgow who asks it and says, what deductions should we draw from the analysis of future land forces for the reserves, which are now, of course, an increasing percentage of land-based capability, given the reduction in the size of the regular numbers?
Sure. So firstly, I think you want reserve units rather than pulling reservists individually into units. And I think you want to use those units to provide specialist functions where those reservists have very considerable expertise outside the military. I think that's a much more rewarding system for the reservists themselves. And it also resolves a lot of the cultural issues where the conventional, the kind of main body of the force doesn't like individual augmentees coming into their units who are seen as less capable or less trained, etc. So I'd say that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that we need to really carefully think about reaggregation and reconstitution. And what that looks like is, if we win the first fight, then that doesn't mean there won't be a second. It does mean that the second might be much less technologically sophisticated. But you need a system for being able to essentially take current line units, promote the people who are currently in post upper rank, and then fill them with mobilized people and train them and bring them up to strength. And demonstrating that you have a system for doing that is a really useful deterrent effect, because then you can say, look, the first fight is going to be really, really hard and you probably won't achieve your objectives. But if you want to play this long and it ends up being attritional, then we're also game. Hopefully you never have to do it, but the fact that you've explained how you might do it becomes a useful way of deterring the adversary, not because you are saying you will win. You don't need to do that. You just need to show that they won't.
Thanks, Jack. We've got less than 2 minutes, so I'm going to be cheeky and pose 2 questions to you and see where you go with those. One of them is, you made the point about the limited demand from the Army on UK manufacturers. So one of the questions is, does the Army recognise that? And should we now be thinking about going to multinational NATO procurement processes, OCCAR, for example? And also perhaps even thinking about, how do we not try to have 1 or 2 of everything, but maybe in alliance think about focusing on specific areas? And the second question is really, what do you think the risks are to achieving what you have suggested? Is MOD and Army well organised to deliver this?
On the first question, the land industrial strategy is in the works. I won't comment on its contents because it's not public yet, but I would say that there is a recognition of the issues that I highlighted. And I will leave it at that and stand by imminently for more detail to come from Defence. On the second one, in terms of barriers and risk, I think there is a real risk that when you start explaining the changes that are required, different bits of the force essentially feel threatened, start to brief against it, you get internal fracturing, and you end up with cat badges driving the politics of cat badges driving capability, which is really unhelpful. It's really unhelpful as well because it means that politicians get a really inaccurate sense of what the debate is, because it generates a lot of noise and heat, but very little light. And so I think the greatest requirement is for leadership in the army to be very, very clear with units and with their people about the changes that need to be made and why they need to be made, so that people don't feel threatened, they feel that there's a mission, they feel that there's a journey, and they feel that there's going to be some consistency. And so the other component of that is there is a perpetual risk, and this is driven by the career cycle where everyone has to kind of make their mark in the 2 years that they're in post. That people kind of say, well, I'm now in post, so we're going to have a new report or a new ConEmp or a new document which will fix all the problems. Just give me a year and I'm going to go away in a cubbyhole with my team of people and we'll write it and then present it to you as the solution. I think framing this as a much more iterative process where we know the direction of travel, we know what we're trying to achieve in terms of characteristics at the end, even if we haven't fixed ourselves on specific solutions, and we're going to work with you and talk with you about how we get there, is absolutely critical to preventing fratricide internally. And I would actually apply that between the services as well. The services do not play nicely together, and the centre tends to exacerbate that, in my view, by playing one service off against the other, rather than cohering them and acting as a shepherd. So I think that's a risk as well that has to be mitigated, and that's a challenge for leadership.
Thank you, and that is certainly a challenge for my chairmanship leadership, because I think you've just generated another 150 questions in your comment about how the centre doesn't help in the services not playing nicely to each other. But I'm afraid we are going to have to call it quits there. For those of you who are interested, then the Whitehall report is available on the RUSI website for free download. Please do that, and we look forward to seeing you at subsequent events where we can continue this conversation. But in the meantime, Jack, thank you for a really fascinating presentation and a really thought-provoking book. And I'm very grateful to you and the audience for such